Okay, I think that I'm I'm up and running, and so if I can have your attention, and if there's any problem, the sound or video or anything later, please let me know. All right. So in the meantime, now let's go on. And I did want to begin with just some announcements related to what the upcoming assessments will be. And I just would mention the fact that I'm very nearly done marking your midterm, and you should have your grades. You can check those on Canvas. If you submitted by Canvas, you should be able to check that and find your grades by the end of the week. All right, so you can look for that. If you didn't submit by Canvas, then I'll send you your grade by email. All right, so in any case, do check that at toward the end of the week. First of all, then, the term paper. This counts for 20% of your assessment. It's not very long. It's just 800 words. And as is, as you can read here, select an example of what is generally regarded as verbal art. All right, so something that is verbal art, it can be a poem, it can be a movie script, it can be an extract from a novel, it can be a speech, a song, anything that is related to the use of language, which might be considered to be uh, artistically put together. Now, in terms of what I want you to be doing is I want you to actually find sources that support the idea that what you have identified is in fact, yes, verbal art or invention or inspiration. But in that sense, I want you to be able to identify outside of yourself, what can you draw from to identify whether or not it's really regarded and highly valued. And the best would be you can find sources that discuss the value of that verbal art. So I want you to do a bit of searching, not just looking at it yourself, but finding what others are saying about it. And I want you then to discuss and illustrate with examples to show how language and metaphor have contributed to the reader's or listener's positive evaluation. The focus of this course is on language and the use of language. Language is a resource in order to be able to craft something which we would call verbal art. And that's one of the aspects that we have been trying to look at in looking at various texts. Well, how is the language being used, and how can we describe that language use? And most important, though, how language as a resource is being used to produce a symbol, produce a metaphor. The idea, as Hassan said, and as some of you already dealt with in your midterm, an extended metaphor. So in what sense and how is that extended metaphor? But I do want you to be looking at language. I want you to have an appreciation for how language plays a role in creating that work of art and creating that response that you have. And I would assume you would be taking a piece of work that you also find and evaluate in a positive way. But in addition, finding other sources that will also back up your claim that this is a highly valued piece of work. So please be thinking about this. This is due on Friday, the 4th of December. Now that will be the end of the review week. And more currently, you do have a continuous participation assignment that is due on Friday this week, 6th of November. And that is 150 to 200 words. And Again, that counts 5 points toward your assessment. What I'm asking you to write about in this continuous participation assignment is, how is spontaneous, extemporaneous, spoken language different from the way we write? In other words, talking on the spot without having sort of planned how we're going to say it. How is that different than planning how we write it and writing it out and the way we write for academic or administrative purposes? Now, this is an issue that we've been talking about, but let me talk about it again a bit more today as well. What is the difference between spoken and written language? I'm referring to what Halliday has written, and specifically I'm drawing on this book which I edited. It's called The Essential Halliday, and basically it took all of the various ideas and concepts that Halliday is referring to over the course of his collected works, and sort of extracting out what were those main key ideas that we would consider essential to his theory. Well, one aspect that he does write about and talk about, and that is the difference between spoken and written language. What does he say? Writing, he says, puts language in chains. It freezes it so that it becomes a thing to be reflected on. Hence, it changes the ways that language is used for meaning with. Puts language in chains. It freezes it. So there is this very static idea that language becomes in terms of writing it. It's put down on the page, it's put down, you key it into the computer, it's sort of fixed. That being the case, then, writing deprives language of the power to intuit, to make indefinitely many connections in different directions at once, to explore by tolerating them contradictions, to represent experience as fluid and indeterminate. So there's an advantage in writing, in consolidating our ideas, but Halliday is saying there's also a disadvantage. It is giving some advantage, but it is at the same time depriving language of the power to, as he puts it there, think on your toes. I'd say think on your feet, but he said think on your toes. Writing deprives the power to just think on the spot. Writing, more fixed, more static. Speaking, more dynamic, changing, can adjust. Going on, he says it creates another potential. He's talking about writing here. Writing creates another potential. Structuring, categorizing, disciplinizing. Yes, it gives it a structure. It gives it a way to think of it in categories. And again, as I put it just a moment ago, it consolidates our thinking. At the same time, it creates a new kind of knowledge, scientific knowledge. It creates a new way of learning. This new way of communicating, a new way of meaning, requires a new way of learning. And that comes across in education. You are educated in many respects in terms of how to express yourself, and very often how to express yourself in writing. We all know that reading and writing are critical in an academic context. Halliday continues, writing changed the social semiotic on two levels. Superficially, he says, it created documentation, the filing of experience, the potential to to look things up. He continues, the world of written language is a nominalized world. Well, remember what we said about nominalization? It sort of itself sort of takes that sort of dynamic quality of the verb that can be changing and transforms it instead into nouns, which are static, which are fixed, which are more, we might even say, concrete. And so the whole idea of what we see in writing is at the same time, well, it's also reflected in the grammar itself. The world of written language is a nominalized world. High lexical density, packed grammatical metaphors. It is these features that enable discourse to become technical. So moving to this technicalized world, this nominalized world. Now take an example. Such an exercise had the potential for intrusions by the government into the legitimate privacy of non-government schools. All right. Unpack that. Such an exercise had the potential for intrusions by the government into the legitimate privacy of non-government schools. So where's the verb? Well, the subject would be such an exercise, right? Had, the verb to have. What we've called a relational process. But then notice what follows the verb. Something rather complicated. The potential for intrusions by the government into the legitimate privacy of non-government schools. How many layers are there? And you're packing so much information into this one sentence. High lexical density is how we talked about it. Basically, it is a simple sentence, a simple clause. It has a grammatical subject, it has a verb, and it has an object, complement. Such an exercise. The potential for intrusions, etc., etc. Very complex nouns. You packed a lot of information into the nouns, but rather it's really, in terms of the clause structure, very simple. Well, let's take a look at it in terms of what we've been talking about. We've talked about there being embedding, the potential for intrusions by the government into the legitimate privacy of non-government schools. You keep embedding one prepositional phrase inside the other, post-modifying the potential, most post-modifying intrusions, post-modifying privacy. Now, we could also say that there is grammatical metaphor taking place here. The idea of the potential, if we wanted to express it as a verb, would be to be able to. Intrusions, intrude. Privacy, private. Here, it's not a verb, of course. Private is an adjective. But we're also saying that verbs and adjectives are turned into nouns. So we see two things happening here. It's grammatical metaphor and it's embedding the two. And this is part of, quite normally, the way we write. It's the way we write, but it's not the way we speak. Unless we are reading and reading aloud what we have written. Halliday continues on this subject. Writing and speaking constitute different ways of knowing, such that any theory of knowledge and of learning must encompass both. In other words, when you think about how we know and how we think and how we understand and pass on knowledge through learning, you have to realize that there's two kinds of activity here. Our understanding, he says, of the social and the natural order depends on both. You need to be able to master both, and on the complementarity between the two is interpretations of experience. Halliday talks a lot about complementarity, and what he's saying is that these two ways of communicating, spoken versus written, they're both necessary. They both serve a purpose. He writes this: written technical discourse, in particular, is characterized by rather simple clause and sentence structures. And we just saw an example of that. It was just one simple clause, but highly lexically dense. He continues, each sentence typically one clause. That clause consisting of just one or two nominal groups. One of them perhaps governed by a preposition, propped up by a verbal group, a verb, who's in that previous example, the verb to have. Usually, as he puts it, a relational process, which is the verb to have, and most typically the verb be. Well, this was not the verb to be, but it was the verb to have. It was a relational process. The nominal groups, on the other hand, may be enormously long and complex, since all the lexical material is compressed into these one or two groups. In spontaneous spoken language, the clause complex often became extraordinarily long and intricate. If we analyze one of these in terms of its hypotactic and paratactic nexuses, we get a sense of its complexity. Now, it's very seldom that we find anything like these in writing. What one can say is that the more intricate a given clause complex is, the more likely it is that it happened in speech than in writing. So what are we saying? We're saying that in written language, it's more complex, not clausally, not in a sense grammatically, but lexically. Because you pack so much information into the noun groups, or what Halliday calls it, the nominal group, through post-modification, through embedding one idea after another, through maybe a string of prepositional phrases like we just saw illustrated. Spoken language is clausally complex. We take our ideas and we string them together paratactically, or we develop our ideas. There is every bit as much organization in spoken language as there is in written. Now, this is important because what we're saying is it's not as though spoken language is, ungrammatical, or it's somehow unstructured or disorganized. No, what he's saying is that there is an organization there, but it's, as he puts it, of a different kind. Written language gains power by its density. Spoken language gains power by its intricacy. Intricacy in terms of clauses. Expanding one clause on another, either paratactically or hypotactically. Now, you remember the example that I gave last time of the judge's summation of evidence. And what was the problem we were pointing out? What the problem we were pointing out was that when you are listening to something, as though it is being spoken, but actually it's reading what was written, It's very different. When we speak spontaneously or as extemporaneously, we have gaps. We repeat. We are able to. We're able to listen to and get the idea. But that's why, if I was to give just a speech, and just give a speech outright without it being written down, and later go to take that speech to write it down, it'd be very different. Would come across very differently. What we noticed here in this and what we identified as features that are typical of written style of communicating, passive constructions and subordinate clauses, with deletion, even the combination of many clauses, but very often involving embedding. This would be the kind of thing that would lead to comprehension problems when it's simply being heard, not being read. Lexical density, we illustrated again with that judge's summation of evidence, and we noticed that there's so many nouns packed in here. That's all in basically this one clause, and it has 15 content words. As Halliday said, when it gets above 13, it's difficult to comprehend. Not so difficult when you're reading it here. If you're reading it off the screen, you probably think, well, that's not that difficult. But think about it that you're listening to it. You're only hearing it. Now, today we're going to take a look at a particular speech. And that speech is from a U.S. President, Richard Nixon. And U.S. President Richard Nixon resigned. He's the only president that has resigned in office. Now, let me just read the comment that's here on the screen. Once Nixon decided that resignation was the only realistic course of action left to him, he told Haig, his chief of staff, to notify Ray Price, his speechwriter, to begin work on the statement. It should not be a breastfeeding mea culpa, not a speech proclaiming guilt that he did not feel. But he wanted that speech to be a healing speech, one that would help rally the country to his successor. So my question is, how successful was that speech in achieving this purpose, this healing speech?
It was a political scandal that changed.
Let me just introduce the video that's to follow. I should have mentioned this. I just want to give you some background. What was it that Nixon resigned? Why did he resign? And here is on the anniversary of this resignation was a brief sort of account of what this was all about. So let's listen to it so that you have some idea of the background to what was taking place.
It was a political scandal that changed our country forever, beginning with the break-in at Democratic National Headquarters in the Watergate office complex, and ending in the resignation of President Richard Nixon. Tonight, on the eve of the 45th anniversary of the Watergate break-in, we take an in-depth look at the events that led to his downfall.
The president is going to address the nation and presumably announce his resignation in a half an hour from now.
People will be at television sets and radios tonight to hear what the president has to say.
This is the political crime story of the century.
In just a moment now, the President of the United States will begin his speech, perhaps his last speech from the White House.
He always saw enemies. He always saw people in the shadows. And his motto, I believe, was, do unto others before they have a chance to do unto you.
That's enough.
There was an obsession with leaks. You don't blame the leaks when facts come out that are showing wrongdoing.
No, there will be no picture.
This is the funny thing. Had it not been for Watergate, I think this man could have gone down in history as one of the more significant presidents in the history of this country.
Out. You don't have to stay, do you?
We were witnessing the implosion of an American presidency.
The President has taken his place at the table in the White House where he's going to speak. Here now, the next picture will be the President of the United States.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
It was the scandal that took down a president, a plot of lies, espionage, and secret dealings that shattered how the nation viewed the presidency and the truth. It all started here, the now infamous Watergate office building, when police were called to investigate a strange break-in.
I was a sergeant assigned to the people on the street, called us the bum squad.
What I looked like in 1972 was like a junior Charles Manson.
Georgetown, Friday night going into Saturday is always crazy back then.
On June 17, 1972, there was a break-in at the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in the Watergate office complex. This was the start of what would be the political crime of the century.
At the center of it all were two men, G. Gordon Liddy, an ex-FBI agent who had been hired by President Nixon's campaign to run covert operations. He recruited James McCord, the security chief of the committee to re-elect the president.
And the plan was to get negative information about the potential nominee of the Democratic Party. But how are you going to get the negative information? A lot of people would say breaking into the Democratic National Committee was way out, off the charts. Yes, but not that far off.
McCord would go into the Watergate building and put in tapes in the door.
It was taped, so it would not lock.
The hero of that night was a man named Frank Wills. Frank Wills was the security guard at the Watergate office building.
You found the door taped once, and you took the tape off. And then you found it taped a second time.
It was something that told me that you should check, not only check the door, but that you call the police.
About 1:52 in the morning, the call comes out for an alleged burglary at the Watergate Hotel. I just kind of blinked my eyes. Yeah, we'll take the call. I had on a old funky golf cap. I think I had just like a T-shirt underneath, trying to give me the image I wasn't a police officer.
If a uniformed car had answered that call, it could have been a whole different ballgame.
There's a lookout, Alfred Baldwin, who's supposed to warn the burglars if there's trouble. The police unit that responds to the call, they're not dressed like police officers. So Baldwin doesn't even notice them.
Our adrenaline is pumped. We get to this room here. I kick the door open.
I pulled my revolver.
Baldwin was supposed to be the lookout across the street.
He was watching a show called Attack of the Puppet People. By the time Alfred Baldwin had notified them, it was too late, and they had to run and hide like rats. We're rolling down this hallway, checking the offices on both sides of the hallways, make sure that nobody's hiding from behind us. I was startled by an arm hitting next to the glass on the petition. It scared the living bejesus out of me. I screamed something to the effect, "Come out with your hands up or I'm gonna blow your head off." 10 hands went up, and they came out, and that's where the arrest occurred, right here. The 5 burglars that were arrested inside the DNC, McCord, Barker, Sturgis, Martinez, and Gonzalez. This was not your normal, typical burglary. There was bugging devices, tear gas pens, many, many rolls of film, locksmith tools, thousands of dollars in $100 bills consecutively ordered.
Who goes into the Democratic National Committee looking for money or looking for jewels? No, you go looking for political information. And who wants that? Why, your opponent, naturally.
People weren't saying, oh my God, this is clearly going to implicate Richard Nixon. It just seemed bizarre. It would take some enterprising young journalists to ferret out the importance of the story.
Woodward and Bernstein were assigned to this burglary just as a matter of routine.
Editors kind of said, we got this strange burglary.
They were young reporters trying to make their way up the ladder in the Washington Post.
When you talk about the people who made a difference when it came to Watergate, you talk about Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein.
They sent me to the courthouse where the 5 burglars caught in the Democratic headquarters were being arraigned. The judge asked the leader, James McCord, where did you work? And McCord went, CIA. It was stunning.
And they discovered that McCord was a security chief for the committee to re-elect the president. Well, okay, folks, this was a political break-in.
There was a notebook belonging to one of the burglars that had the name in it, H. Hunt W. House. And of course, it turned out to be Howard Hunt, who had worked for the CIA, who had been hired at the White House really to undertake dirty tricks.
You knew that this smoke that was billowing up from the Oval Office, there had to be some fire there.
It's like the Dylan song, it don't take a weatherman to know which way the wind blows.
Presidential Press Secretary Ron Ziegler called it a third-rate burglary attempt and said it was nothing the president would ever be concerned with.
Richard Nixon is obstructing justice from the beginning. But what would be known as the smoking gun was when he approves a plan to use the CIA to blunt an FBI investigation into the money that the burglars had. It's clear in the conversation this is being done for political purposes, basically to save the skin of the White House, and the president says he approves it.
Woodward and Bernstein had scores of sources, but there was one source that was special. A guy really high up. He was known as Deep Throat.
We would learn years later that Deep Throat was Mark Felt, number 2 at the FBI.
He was in the perfect position to understand what was coming into the investigation, as well as what he could observe maybe from above the investigation.
I want to talk about Watergate.
We're not going to talk about that subject.
All the president's men created a sense of danger. They were constantly risking things by trying to find out the truth.
You can trust me, you know that.
The other thing the movie did was create that expression, follow the money.
Just follow the money.
And put it into American culture.
Deep Throat made it clear that the money was important, that there was a trail to follow. And Carl established that a $25,000 check had actually gone into the bank account of one of the Watergate burglars.
The $25,000 check linked contributions to President Nixon's re-election campaign to the slush fund used to pay the burglars who broke into the Watergate office complex.
I said, oh my God. This now establishes an undeniable connection between the committee for Nixon's re-election and the burglars.
John Mitchell was the Attorney General. He was a Nixon loyalist.
The highest law enforcement officer in America controlled a secret fund that paid for undercover activities against Nixon's political opponents. Bradley said they're about to call the Attorney General of the United States a crook. There's never been a story like this in our history. And we took a deep breath and said, yeah.
ABC News has projected that Richard Nixon has in fact been re-elected to the presidency to a second term. So the question now, I suppose, is how big will Mr. Nixon win?
It was a giant landslide. There was virtually no reaction to the stories we did. And it was a way of saying, Watergate? Who cares?
And whatever happened to Watergate? I don't know. Apparently nothing. They've got a trial of the accused in that case, and that's going to be tried in due course, and I think that's probably the end of the story.
Okay, so that was the background. Why Nixon resigned, because there had been an obstruction of justice. And in the end, Congress looked willing to impeach him. And rather than go through that course of action, Nixon decided to resign and to leave office. What we're going to take a look at today is, in this next hour, is the resignation speech, when he went on television and actually resigned. We're then going to look at how people responded to that speech and what did they respond to it. The main thing is, though, remember, it was to be a healing speech. Now, what you see on your screen at the top is a word cloud, the kinds of words that occurred most frequently: president, people, office, and you'll even notice the word must there. That modal auxiliary, must, occurred so frequently that it stands out. At the bottom of your screen, you sort of see a map of the structure. And I've highlighted something in sort of a red box that everything seems to point back to. And that was at that point when Nixon said, "I will resign."
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Okay, now that was sort of what everyone was waiting for. They were waiting for that sort of climactic point that he would actually at this point say and declare, "I resign." Well, that was where it occurred in the text. We're going to take a look at the rest of the text itself and sort of see what preceded it and what followed it. Again, though, remember that came in paragraph 8 when he actually said he would resign. So let's just sort of compare the word cloud. The whole text, I just showed you that a moment ago. Must, people, president, office. Now, look at the word cloud for just that part leading up to when he said he would resign. And this was just as you could see, just at the beginning of what would be a longer speech. Well, president, office, yes, nation, Congress. All right, we don't see that modal auxiliary there. You don't see that sort of coming in at this point. So it's still about the presidency. It's about the office. It's about the nation. We do see that those words appear throughout the whole text. So in a way, paragraphs 1 through 8 do sort of reflect what the whole text was really going to be about. In fact, quite closely. But there are some things that are there in the text which had to follow that statement, "I will resign," that do not play a big role at the beginning in the first 8 paragraphs. Here's the first 8 paragraphs.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape the history of this nation. Each time I have done so to discuss with you some matter that I believe affected the national interest. In all the decisions I have made in my public life, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation. Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere, to make every possible effort to complete the term of office to which you elected me. In the past few days, however, it has become evident to me that I no longer have a strong enough political base in the Congress to justify continuing that effort. As long as there was such a base, I felt strongly that it was necessary to see the constitutional process through to its conclusion, that to do otherwise would be unfaithful to the spirit of that deliberately difficult process and a dangerously destabilizing precedent for the future. But with the disappearance of that base, I now believe that the constitutional purpose has been served, and there is no longer a need for the process to be prolonged. I would have preferred to carry through to the finish, whatever the personal agony it would have involved. And my family unanimously urged me to do so. But the interests of the nation must always come before any personal considerations. From the discussions I have had with congressional and other leaders, I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary to back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation will require. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issues of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Okay, well, before we go on, since we are nearly to 10 to the hour, we'll take a break here. Before we come back, and you might have noticed that I was sort of paying attention to his use of modal auxiliaries. And we're going to take a look at how that figures into the speech and how it sort of reflects something of the structure of the speech as a whole, its architecture. All right, so we're up to that point. He's resigned, and we're going to just take a look at that part that precedes it and then take note of what follows and how that speech then was perceived and how it was responded to. Okay, so we'll take a break there, and we can come back in about 10 minutes. So, okay, thank you. Well, we'll see, and I suppose I should come back online. Okay, everybody, we just had a little bit of discussion about the U.S. Presidential election, which is taking place, as you most likely know. And just let me share the polling. I only have some responses, but let me share the results with you. So majority of you would have been voting for Trump if you were in the US. I guess 15, 7 of you for Biden, and 8 of you, no opinion. Well, it's an interesting to see what takes place and how people are voting and what the outcome is going to be in the U.S. That's quite interesting to watch. And it was quite interesting to watch what was going to happen to Nixon. He had just won re-election, defeating his opponent in a landslide. He looked to have 4 more years in which he would continue to be developing relations with China, with Russia, ending the war in Vietnam. He looked to be in a very strong position, and everything fell apart. Everything fell apart because of the Watergate scandal. And as you just saw in the video before, it's something that was really because he's caught in a lie, and therefore this sort of brought his presidency to an end. Now, we just were looking at the first part of his speech, and this was up to that point. Now, you take a look at what you see on your screen, all right? And what you see on your screen, you see, for example, I'm highlighting the use of the modal auxiliaries. It's quite interesting. Now, notice shall, the first one. The shall appears, well, it appears in 8, where he says, I shall resign. It appears in later on, or in the middle, and then toward the end, sort of in a way, sort of marking pivotal moments in the speech. But I was interested in leading up to that point where he says, I shall resign. What kind of modal auxiliaries was he using? You'll notice that would appeared quite frequently, because up to that point where he resigned in paragraph 8, before that he was still the president, and it was still almost hypothetical, the situation in which he was in and what he was talking about. It hadn't been yet realized, and it wouldn't be realized until he got to paragraph 8, and he says, I shall resign. And before that, it was sort of looking in terms of hypothetically what it would be like if he hadn't resigned. Leading up to that point where then he says, I shall resign. Then what happens? Then you notice that the modal auxiliary will kicks in. And from paragraph 8 onwards, you notice will. Now, what does will express? It's the future. It's sort of a certainty about what's going to transpire, what will take place. It's no longer there sort of hypothetically. It's now a certainty. He's resigned, and this is what will be taking place in the future. When we take a look at it and look at the speech that he gives, I shall resign as the president effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will. I feel a great sadness that I will. Now it's certain. He's resigned. And now it's what will take place in the future. And that's the whole orientation of what follows. You'll notice it's repeated. Will. It's a very different sort of picture that now emerges. It's the future. It's the future without him as president. Then it leads up to paragraph 17, and then where he says, I shall leave this office with regret. And so it's another pivotal moment in the speech. Each time he says shall, it is sort of indicating a particular decision that he has made. The one was to resign, and here it's what will happen now as he leaves office. I shall leave this office with regret. And what's he say?
I shall leave this office with regret at not completing my term, but with gratitude for the privilege of serving as your president for the past 5.5 years. These years have been a momentous time in the history of our nation and the world. They have been a time of achievement in which we can all be proud. Achievements that represent the shared efforts of the administration, the Congress, and the people. But the challenges ahead are equally great, and they too will require the support and the efforts of the Congress and the people, working in cooperation with the new administration. We have ended America's longest war, but in the work of securing a lasting peace in the world, the goals ahead are even more far-reaching and more difficult. We must complete a structure of peace so that it will be said of this generation, our generation of Americans, by the people of all nations, not only that we ended one war, but that we prevented future wars. We have unlocked the doors that for 1/4 of a century stood between the United States and the People's Republic of China. We must now ensure that the 1/4 of the world's people who live in the People's Republic of China will be and remain not our enemies, but our friends. In the Middle East, 100 million people in the Arab countries, many of whom have considered us their enemy for nearly 20 years, now look on us as their friends. We must continue to build on that friendship so that peace can settle at last over the Middle East, and so that the cradle of civilization will not become its grave. Together with the Soviet Union, we have made the crucial breakthroughs that have begun the process of limiting nuclear arms. But we must set as our goal not just limiting, but reducing and finally destroying these terrible weapons so that they cannot destroy civilization, and so that the threat of nuclear war will no longer hang over the world and the people. We have opened a new relation with the Soviet Union. We must continue to develop and expand that new relationship so that the two strongest nations of the world will live together in cooperation rather than confrontation. Around the world, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, there are millions of people who live in terrible poverty, even starvation. We must keep as our goal turning away from production for war and expanding production for peace, so that people everywhere on this earth can at last look forward in their children's time, if not in our own time, to having the necessities for a decent life. Here in America, we are fortunate that most of our people have not only the blessings of liberty, but also the means to live full and good, and by the world's standards, even abundant lives. We must press on, however, toward a goal not only of more and better jobs, but of full opportunity for every American. And of what we are striving so hard right now to achieve, prosperity without inflation.
Okay, now, in this part, he speaks in it's almost as though it is his second inaugural address. It is almost as though he's still president. You'll notice that the use of must occurs a number of times. And in addition to will, we notice here we must continue. We must set as our goal. We, again, paragraph 24, we must, and then what the world will be when this is carried out. We must keep as our goal. We must press on. So he's still almost in that role of being like the president in terms of what must be the way forward. And so that must occurs quite a bit in this part, paragraphs 17 through 26. And it's all about his positive achievements. Now, must and people, it occurs a lot in this section here. But I want you to notice something else, and I don't know if you noticed it as you were listening to it. Who must? Who is the initiator? Who is doing it? Now, you'll notice that, and you can see from the screen here, I've indicated where it is third person. He, him, his, or whether it's first person, I, me, my. But do you notice in this section, paragraphs 17 through 26, there's no first person. There's no third person. It's we, together. It is that's why I say it almost came across as being like his second inaugural. It's still speaking to a unity and a togetherness that he is hoping to achieve with the American people. It's a very different, this whole part, 17 through 26, it's a very different texture than the whole rest of the text. It's all about his achievements. And you'll notice that, I don't know if you noticed it as you were watching it, he smiles several times. This is his resignation speech. But almost as though it shifts back into how he would be speaking as if he were still the president. So taking a look at the speech as a whole, now when it comes to paragraph 27 onwards, it's back. It's back to first person. And I'm going to play it in a moment. And what you'll notice is that there is a large, well, I won't say it's large, I'll say it's noticeable gap between when he ends with paragraph 26 and when he ends that section, which was all about we and us and our, and paragraph 27 where he picks it up then and it becomes back to first person, and there's a gap there. In this part, there is also reference to shall 3 times. Shall continue in that spirit. I shall continue. I shall always. It's his future.
For more than a quarter of a century in public life, I have shared in the turbulent history of this era. I have fought for what I believed in. I have tried, to the best of my ability, to discharge those duties and meet those responsibilities that were entrusted to me. Sometimes I have succeeded, and sometimes I have failed. But always, I have taken heart from what Theodore Roosevelt once said about the man in the arena whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes short again and again, because there is not effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deed, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumphs of high achievements, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. I pledge to you tonight that as long as I have a breath of life in my body, I shall continue in that spirit. I shall continue to work for the great causes to which I have been dedicated throughout my years as a congressman, a senator, vice president, and president. The cause of peace, not just for America, but among all nations. Prosperity, justice, and opportunity for all of our people. There is one cause, above all, to which I have been devoted, and to which I shall always be devoted for as long as I live. When I first took the oath of office as president 5.5 years ago, I made this sacred commitment to consecrate my office, my energies, and all the wisdom I can summon to the cause of peace among nations. I've done my very best in all the days since to be true to that pledge. As a result of these efforts, I am confident that the world is a safer place today, not only for the people of America, but for the people of all nations. And that all of our children have a better chance than before of living in peace rather than dying in war. This, more than anything, is what I hoped to achieve when I sought the presidency. This, more than anything, is what I hope will be my legacy to you, to our country, as I leave the presidency. To have served in this office is to have felt a very personal sense of kinship with each and every American. In leaving it, I do so with this prayer. May God's grace be with you in all the days ahead.
Well, did it suit the purpose? I mean, it was supposed to be a healing speech. we look at what was the main ideas that came across in those last few paragraphs that conclude it, there doesn't really, it was more his achievements than anything that was what he was trying to show. In this sort of first person, again it's I, and again it's himself talking about it. I wanted to look at what was theme. Remember what we call theme? Remember we said the theme in sort of this idea of how you begin each clause, right? Well, you'll notice that what is theme in that part 17 through 26 is we. It does come across very clearly, we. First person isn't come across as the beginning of the clauses so much as what we observe when we just look at their occurrence throughout the text. But when you look at that at the bottom there, in terms of the choices of theme, the interpersonal, the subject as a circumstance, the clause as a circumstance, and you look at the back, you'll notice that there's quite a few things as theme. In other words, what did occur as theme? What did he put first? It wasn't I. It wasn't, except for that part, we, yes, was quite a bit. But other than that, what he was putting first were the circumstances. In other words, he was framing what he was doing here in terms of his leaving of office, in terms of the circumstances that made that necessary. And that is what he put first. And that is how he shaped the speech. It comes across in terms of the circumstances throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, in the past few days, with the disappearance of that base. These are all, in other words, what was first, what was prominent at the beginning of, throughout the speech, are the circumstances that made it necessary for him to resign, for him to leave office. And so if we take a look at his second inaugural, and we take a look at, for example, in terms of comparing this resignation speech with his second inaugural, looking at what occurs sort of in theme position. Remember, theme is how you begin each clause. There's some interpersonal theme. I, we, others, about 47% compared to 65% for his second inaugural. Now, what increased? It was the circumstances. The subject as a circumstance, the clause as a circumstance, all of those aspects that indicated the conditions under which it was necessary for him to resign. In other words, the nature of the text is really reflected in the choices that are made, whether it's choices of what is the modal auxiliary, or the choice of what is the theme, or even the use of who is the initiator of actions. How did people respond? Now, this was the night when he gave the speech.
So, Richard Milhouse Nixon has resigned as the 37th President of the United States, effective at when Gerald Ford, the Vice President, will be sworn in as the 38th President of the United States. It was a 16-minute speech in which the President seemed calm but controlling, obviously, very deep emotions. He did not, I think my colleagues will agree, confess any crimes in regard to the Watergate or any other matters. He said that he was guilty perhaps of some bad judgment, but that was all. Eric?
Yes, there have been no further admissions. Perhaps it was foolish for people on the Hill and some of us to think that there might have been. He has said, in effect, he is not resigning because of a sense of guilt, of any criminality, but because his political base has eroded in the Congress, and he could not be effective even if he went on through the long periods of impeachment and trial in the Senate, and therefore it's best to cut this thing short in the interest of the whole country. On the whole, it seemed to me as effective, as magnanimous a speech as Mr. Nixon has ever made. And I suppose there'll be many, even among his critics, who will say that perhaps that few things in his presidency became him as much as his manner of leaving the presidency. Certainly no attacks on his enemies, none on the press, as we did have from Vice President Agnew a year ago when he resigned. I think people will find it very hard to fault this. A man is certainly entitled to call attention with his last words as president to what he considers his positive acts, which are those of trying to make peace in this world. Obviously, that is how he wishes to be remembered. And perhaps that will be the positive side of his record, even for many years to come, I think.
It certainly was a conciliatory speech. He even paid tribute to those who have been in opposition to him, which hasn't always been the case with President Nixon's speeches, and said he was sure that their interests in the country were the same as his, but they approached the problem from different viewpoints. Dan Rather, our White House correspondent, Roger Mudd, our Capitol Hill correspondent, are with us also, along with Eric, in the studio here in Washington. Gentlemen, your reactions for tonight's speech.
Walter, I think it may very well go down when history takes a look at it as one of Richard Nixon's, if not his finest hour. He's to be made clear and can't be reemphasized too often, I think, as I think the President made clear in his speech. There is no joy in this for anyone tonight. No decent thinking American could take any joy out of this. That sadness is tempered by, for many, with awe for the constitutional process, what we sometimes call the system, which worked magnificently. It was that constitutional process, it was a process of law, which brought us to this moment. The President in his speech made clear that he respects that, he understands that, he has that appreciation and that awe for it. He did give, and I would agree with Walter, what you said, he gave to this moment a touch of class, more than that, a touch of majesty, touching that nerve in most people that says to their brain, we revere the presidency, we respect the president, the republic, and the country comes first.
Yeah, it's interesting to me in terms of looking at the response that was given to that speech. A touch of majesty, a touch of class. It's in this particular moment, it may be one of his best speeches. It's very interesting, the response that people gave to that speech. And what was there then, we might ask, about the speech itself that caused people to respond the way they did? Perhaps it was the absence of the negativity. Perhaps it was the absence of attacks, and the positive, the emphasis on what will be, what must be done, all looking forward to a future. Even though he's stepping down, it was very future oriented. The will. And when he has that one section on what we as a nation must do and will do, that is all looking forward, all looking ahead. And perhaps that is in the nature of why people responded the way they did. I mean, those newsmen that were just speaking were by no means sort of people that were fans of Richard Nixon. They, just like the media today for Trump, they were highly critical. So it was striking their own conciliatory tone in terms of their response. Now, that was his resignation speech. Now, I've played for you before the speech that he gave the next day. And to me, that really highlights the difference between a speech that was prepared, that was crafted, that was deliberate, and a speech that was just him speaking on the cuff without any sort of preparation, with all mainly his thoughts as they just progressed.
something else I'd like for you to tell your young people. You know, people often come in and say, what'll I tell my kids? You know, they look at government and it's sort of a rugged life, and they see the mistakes that are made. They get the impression that everybody is here for the purpose of feathering his nest. That's why I made this earlier point. Not in this administration. Not one single man or woman. And I say to them, there are many fine careers. This country needs good farmers, good businessmen, good plumbers, good carpenters. I remember my old man. I think that they would have called him sort of a little man, common man. He didn't consider himself that way. You know what he was? He was a streetcar motorman first, and then he was a farmer, and then he had a lemon ranch. It was the poorest lemon ranch in California, I can assure you. He sold it before they found oil on it. And then he was a grocer. But he was a great man. Because he did his job. And every job counts, up to the hilt, regardless of what happened. Nobody will ever write a book, probably, about my mother. Well, I guess all of you would say this about your mother. My mother was a saint. And I think of her, 2 boys dying of tuberculosis, nursing 4 others in order that she could take care of my older brother for 3 years in Arizona, and seeing each of them die, and when they died, it was like one of her own. Yes, she will have no books written about her. But she was a saint. Now, however, we look to the future.
All right, now, that is very clearly without thought in terms of planning what he's going to say. It obviously, there was just an association, good farmers, good businessmen, good plumbers, good carpenters. That just was coming off the top of his head. I remember my old man. I think it was all very mental. It was all very much what was his thoughts, and it progresses, and then. That's how we talk. That's very paratactic. It has a structure. It has a grammar, and a very different one from the way that we write. We've said before, and it's a concept I want you to be sure to understand, and that is how we connect clauses up. We say parataxis, there's a symmetry. We just sort of, and the plus sign here is deliberate. We're just sort of adding on the ideas. John enjoys reading, and he likes swimming. And is a very typical way that we use to just sort of link ideas and extend them one after the other. But it takes a bit of thought to sort of develop our ideas, to see a relationship, one which there was one idea that is sort of central and core, and the other which is sort of peripheral, it's sort of added on, and we call that hypotaxis. We said that this is my father is the alpha clause. And who is teaching here is describing, it's elaborating, it's sort of that, it's that the satellite to the nucleus that is the core idea. This is my father. Now, in grammar, we usually call that a non-restrictive relative clause. It's an additional idea. And very often we indicate it with a comma, and that comma just indicates that it's additional information. This is my brother. Who is studying here? It's just something additional. It's not telling you which brother. That we call a restrictive relative clause. And that who is studying here now becomes no longer functioning like a clause by itself. It's part of that noun phrase. This is my brother. It becomes embedded within that noun phrase. Rank shifted. We call that a restrictive relative clause. And you remember from Obama's first debate where he embedded so much, it was so clausally complex because obviously he hadn't prepared that. That was not something which he would have had sort of prepared and sort of memorized. He was doing it almost spontaneously and as the ideas popped into his head and then as they developed. That's the difference between speaking and writing. Speaking is more paratactic. Hypotaxis requires some ideas developing. Now, that's just part of the story, though. We said that sort of logical structuring, whether it's symmetrically balanced, paratactic, equal sides, sort of, so to speak, compared to sort of an imbalance. It's asymmetrical. One idea is more important, more primary than the other. That's just part of the story because we then, as we said, can use that to sort of elaborate ideas. That non-defining relative clause, that's hypotaxis, that's elaborating. That's who is teaching here, giving you more information. We can just extend ideas one after the other. It can be paratactic with a conjunction like and or but, or it could be an adverbial instead of going out with his friends. It can be enhancing, sort of giving you sort of the circumstances, the where, when, why, how. And finally, it can be projecting, saying what you're saying or what you're thinking. Now, we've looked at this before, and we're looking at it in the context of people speaking. And remember the criticism of Donald Trump. And the criticism that was made was that he uses hypotaxis. He doesn't use hypotaxis, and arguing that maybe he can't even seem to use hypotaxis, which was nonsense because he does use hypotaxis. He can read a scripted text before him. But the point was, when he is speaking off the cuff and spontaneously, then we do see a change. And that was what we illustrated with his speech to Congress and the speech to the CIA. Now, I want you to notice, and we made this point before, when in speech or in writing, what is the sort of proportion that you expect? It's not to say there's no hypotaxis. In his speech to the CIA with Trump, it was sort of 50-50. But what do we notice when it is a scripted speech, whether it was Nixon's second inaugural or his resignation? Almost 30-70. It was almost the same. In that departure speech, it was largely paratactic. There's some hypotaxis, of course. Likewise with Obama's speeches. Almost the same kind of percentage, almost the same kind of proportion. So, in fact, written, to be spoken, does have sort of we could say, a proportion that is quite expected, we can anticipate. And it's when it almost shifts to 50-50 or more paratactic that we notice it as more spoken like, not written like. So what does it matter then, spoken versus written? You remember I gave this example from the recent winner of America's Got Talent and his spoken word performance. But the point was that, of course, he prepared it. It was like poetry, but it was like spoken word. It wasn't like it was written out. Alfred Lord Tennyson's In Memoriam, likewise, was a poem, but it was crafted in such a way as to almost seem like spoken discourse, highly paratactic. Well, the point is, you see, you can use this sort of awareness of the difference between spoken and written, and it can even become part of the craft itself, that you can make something which is written sound like it is spoken. Well, that's what we're going to be taking a look at. And the next thing that we're going to be looking at is Steve Jobs' commencement address. Steve Jobs, you know what a commencement address is. He's speaking and he is delivering this address to graduates. What do you think is the purpose of a commencement speech? It's to inspire, to motivate, to pass on knowledge to these new graduates based on the experience of someone who's supposed to be highly regarded, great deal of experience, and speaking their words of wisdom to these graduates. Now we're going to take a look at his commencement address. Now, first thing, before we get to listening to it, I want you to notice something about it. It is very, what should I say? He reads it. It's scripted, okay? And it's very much by design. And you can say, just like with Obama's speeches, which were, you notice the sort of the rule of three. Repeat things 3 times. You'll notice that I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great, about 3 times. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle, 3 times. Yeah, all the examples that I'm going to be showing here on the screen here are all examples of where he repeats things in 3s. All external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment. It means to try to tell your kids everything you thought you'd have the next 10 years to tell them in just a few months. It means to make sure everything is buttoned up so that it will be as easy as possible for your family. It means to say your goodbyes. Okay, so things in 3s. Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. Okay, so, and at the very end, he will use a phrase, stay hungry, stay foolish. He'll repeat it 3 times. So there is, very obviously, it's crafted, it's by design. But there's another thing also, and that is the use of antithesis. Some might say antithesis. It's a juxtaposition of contrasting ideas, often with a sort of parallel structure. Dropped out, dropped in. Dropped out, dropped in. Look forward, look backwards. The heaviness, the lightness. The dead, life, death and life, old and new. These contrasts are throughout the speech. We're going to take a look, and we'll take a break first and then come back to start going through it. But this is the word cloud. I usually like to do a word cloud when I look at a text for the first time and start analyzing it, just to get an idea of what was sort of the main ideas that come through here. And life, college, Apple. Okay, so it just gives me some idea of what might be sort of the themes that come through here in this particular address. So we're going to stop here, take a break, because I don't want to start getting into it and then interrupt. So let's take a break here and come back in about 10 minutes or so. Okay, thank you. Okay, everybody, let's continue. And we are talking about the commencement address delivered by Steve Jobs. And as I mentioned before we took the break, it is a very well crafted speech. It has the things in threes, which is a device that is used to sort of give a speech a certain, what should I say, eloquence to it? Yes, because it is sort of a deliberate technique that makes what we would hope, what we would expect the speech to be more effective. The use of opposites. What's interesting, especially, is when you look at the speech and where you notice that he uses both techniques at the same time. Then it becomes almost a speech that is almost as crafted as a kind of poetry. Looking at the speech in terms of the word cloud, you notice life and Apple and college. So he's going to talk about his college years. Apple is not so prominent. Now, in fact, he divides the speech into three parts, very noticeably, because he says that he is going to deliver three stories. Now, you can sort of look at these three stories and have a pretty good idea from the word cloud what the stories are about. Well, the first one, college, yes. The second one, Apple. And the third one, death. Three stories. The first is college life. Second, his time at Apple, getting fired from Apple. And the third, his experience with cancer and facing death. So he delivers these three stories, and he breaks them into three parts. They are very, very clearly three different stories that make up his speech. Now, as you listen to it, I want you to listen to it with an idea as to how do you respond to it? How do you find it in terms of listening to it? Would you say that it sounds very written-like, very scripted-like? Here's the first story.
Today, I want to tell you three stories from my life. That's it. No big deal. Just three stories. The first story is about connecting the dots. I dropped out of Reed College after the first 6 months, but then stayed around as a drop-in for another 18 months or so before I really quit. So why'd I drop out? It started before I was born. My biological mother was a young, unwed graduate student, and she decided to put me up for adoption. She felt very strongly that I should be adopted by college graduates, so everything was all set for me to be adopted at birth by a lawyer and his wife. Except that when I popped out, they decided at the last minute that they really wanted a girl. So my parents, who were on a waiting list, got a call in the middle of the night asking, "We've got an unexpected baby boy. Do you want him?" They said, "Of course." My biological mother found out later that my mother had never graduated from college and that my father had never graduated from high school. She refused to sign the final adoption papers. She only relented a few months later when my parents promised that I would go to college. This was the start in my life. And 17 years later, I did go to college. But I naively chose a college that was almost as expensive as Stanford. And all of my working class parents' savings were being spent on my college tuition. After 6 months, I couldn't see the value in it. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, and no idea how college was going to help me figure it out. And here I was, spending all of the money my parents had saved their entire life. So I decided to drop out and trust that it would all work out okay. It was pretty scary at the time, but looking back, it was one of the best decisions I ever made. The minute I dropped out, I could stop taking the required classes that didn't interest me and begin dropping in on the ones that looked far more interesting. It wasn't all romantic. I didn't have a dorm room, so I slept on the floor in friends' rooms. I returned Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposits to buy food with. And I would walk the 7 miles across town every Sunday night to get one good meal a week at the Hare Krishna temple. I loved it. And much of what I stumbled into by following my curiosity and intuition turned out to be priceless later on. Let me give you one example. Reed College at that time offered perhaps the best calligraphy instruction in the country. Throughout the campus, every poster, every label on every drawer was beautifully hand calligraphed. Because I had dropped out and didn't have to take the normal classes, I decided to take a calligraphy class to learn how to do this. I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle in a way that science can't capture, and I found it fascinating. None of this had even a hope of any practical application in my life. But 10 years later, when we were designing the first Macintosh computer, it all came back to me. And we designed it all into the Mac. It was the first computer with beautiful typography. If I had never dropped in on that single course in college, the Mac would have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts. And since Windows just copied the Mac, it's likely that no personal computer would have them. If I had never dropped out, I would have never dropped in on that calligraphy class, and personal computers might not have the wonderful typography that they do. Of course, it was impossible to connect the dots looking forward when I was in college, but it was very, very clear looking backwards 10 years later. Again, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever. Because believing that the dots will connect down the road will give you the confidence to follow your heart, even when it leads you off the well-worn path. And that will make all the difference.
Okay, that's the first story. Now, just in looking at, for example, the kinds of verbs, processes that make up the story, and we'll call this story one, connecting the dots. And I just basically have counted how many are sort of relational verbs. What are those? The verbs to be, the verb to have. Material, those are the doing kinds of words. Mental, thinking, feeling. And verbal, saying, expressing something, communicating. If I take a look at these, then what about that first story? What is it largely? It's largely about doing. There's some descriptive, that's 24%, but there isn't a whole lot of mental, there isn't a whole lot of thinking that's going on here. It's mainly doing. Let's look at story 2.
My second story is about love and loss. I was lucky. I found what I loved to do early in life. Woz and I started Apple in my parents' garage when I was 20. We worked hard, and in 10 years, Apple had grown from just the two of us in a garage into a $2 billion company with over 4,000 employees. We just released our finest creation, the Macintosh, a year earlier, and I just turned 30. And then I got fired. How can you get fired from a company you started? Well, as Apple grew, we hired someone who I thought was very talented to run the company with me. And for the first year or so, things went well. But then our visions of the future began to diverge, and eventually we had a falling out. When we did, our board of directors sided with him. And so at 30, I was out, and very publicly out. What had been the focus of my entire adult life was gone, and it was devastating. I really didn't know what to do for a few months. I felt that I had let the previous generation of entrepreneurs down, that I had dropped the baton as it was being passed to me. I met with David Packard and Bob Noyce and tried to apologize for screwing up so badly. I was a very public failure, and I even thought about running away from the Valley. But something slowly began to dawn on me. I still loved what I did. The turn of events at Apple had not changed that one bit. I'd been rejected, but I was still in love. And so I decided to start over. I didn't see it then, but it turned out that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, less sure about everything. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life. During the next 5 years, I started a company named Next, another company named Pixar, and fell in love with an amazing woman who would become my wife. Pixar went on to create the world's first computer animated feature film, Toy Story, and is now the most successful animation studio in the world. In a remarkable turn of events, Apple bought Next, and I returned to Apple, and the technology we developed at Next is at the heart of Apple's current renaissance. And Lorene and I have a wonderful family together. I'm pretty sure none of this would have happened if I hadn't been fired from Apple. It was awful tasting medicine, but I guess the patient needed it. Sometimes life's going to hit you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith. I'm convinced that the only thing that kept me going was that I loved what I did. You've got to find what you love. And that is as true for work as it is for your lovers. Your work is going to fill a large part of your life. And the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking and don't settle. As with all matters of the heart, you'll know when you find it. And like any great relationship, it just gets better and better as the years roll on. So keep looking. Don't settle.
All right. Now, have you begun to notice a pattern that emerges in these two stories that you've heard so far? It's very first person, right? I. But do you notice that at the end of each story, it becomes you? He's addressing his audience. And it becomes, the focus shifts from I, first person, to you. And it's always in a way sort of an imperative, don't settle. And so it is, he's addressing an audience, but most of what his story is, of course, first person. Now, just from what you've heard so far, how does it sound to you? How do you respond to it? Is it difficult to follow what he's saying? No, very straightforward. It's like he's talking to you. It's like he's telling you his story. It doesn't sound so heavily scripted. In fact, it has a lot of those features of what we would expect with spoken. It seems, I might use the word, engaging. And so the question comes back then, why does it seem engaging? Why is it interesting? Yes, he's an interesting person, but nonetheless, it is still, even though he's obviously reading it, it's reading something which has been written to sound like spoken. Again, I'm looking at the verbs and the processes, and you'll notice that it's, again, highly relational in the 30%, not that much different than the first story. And it's also a little bit less material, but a little bit more mental, a little bit more his feelings, his thinking on having been fired from Apple and so forth. He's responding to it. Okay, let's go on a third story.
My third story is about death. When I was 17, I read a quote that went something like, "If you live each day as if it was your last, someday you'll most certainly be right." It made an impression on me, and since then, for the past 33 years, I've looked in the mirror every morning and asked myself, if today were the last day of my life, would I want to do what I am about to do today? And whenever the answer has been no for too many days in a row, I know I need to change something. Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. You are already naked. There is no reason not to follow your heart. About a year ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. I had a scan at 7:30 in the morning, and it clearly showed a tumor on my pancreas. I didn't even know what a pancreas was. The doctors told me this was almost certainly a type of cancer that is incurable, and that I should expect to live no longer than 3 to 6 months. My doctor advised me to go home and get my affairs in order, which is doctor's code for prepare to die. It means to try and tell your kids everything you thought you'd have the next 10 years to tell them in just a few months. It means to make sure everything is buttoned up so that it will be as easy as possible for your family. It means to say your goodbyes. I lived with that diagnosis all day. Later that evening, I had a biopsy where they stuck an endoscope down my throat, through my stomach and into my intestines, put a needle into my pancreas and got a few cells from the tumor. I was sedated, but my wife, who was there, told me that when they viewed the cells under a microscope, the doctors started crying because it turned out to be a very rare form of pancreatic cancer that is curable with surgery. I had the surgery, and thankfully, I'm fine now. This was the closest I've been to facing death, and I hope it's the closest I get for a few more decades. Having lived through it, I can now say this to you with a bit more certainty than when death was a useful but purely intellectual concept. No one wants to die. Even people who want to go to heaven don't want to die to get there. And yet, death is the destination we all share. No one has ever escaped it. And that is as it should be, because death is very likely the single best invention of life. It's life's change agent. It clears out the old to make way for the new. Right now, the new is you. But someday, not too long from now, you will gradually become the old and be cleared away. Sorry to be so dramatic, but it's quite true. Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. Everything else is secondary.
Okay, so that's the third story. We'll come back to the closing in a moment. Again, noticing what is sort of the use of the verbs and so forth. More relational processes, way more. Way less doing. Of course, he's talking about being sick and near death, facing death. So there's much less doing in this. Still, there's not a whole lot about the mental processes, but there is more in terms of what was said. We do notice, of course, that there's so much I. There's so much first person. It's obviously a very first person story. It's his stories. In a commencement speech, how appropriate is it that it is very first person? Well, what is a commencement speech? It's supposed to be that individual who, as I said, is probably someone usually very prominent, usually famous. Well, and how famous depends on the university, who they can get. But the idea being that it should be them telling you their experience, their shared knowledge, which they're passing on to you graduates as you face life going out. And that's one of the reasons why you remember that David Foster Wallace commencement speech, which was regarded as a commencement speech which was very different than the usual style. This one is quite typical. It's very first person, it's his stories, but always concluding each story, almost very much like a formula. He tell you the story, and at the end of the story, he bring it around to you. Now, the question would be, all right, take that division into process types and so forth, and look, where was it first person as the initiator of those processes? So if 56% of the first story was doing, how much of the doing was done by Steve Jobs? Well, a third, 33%. Second story, 20%. Third story, 14%. His role became less. In the first one, in the college one, yes, it was all about what his choices were and what he did. In the second story, he got fired. In the third story, he faced death. And in both of these, his role, his ability to be more or less in control was less. And that's sort of reflected in the nature of these processes of doing. Is doing becomes less, and his role as the doer becomes much less as well. His control over his own circumstances was much less. In the first story, he was in control. That was the point. He dropped out and he could do what he wanted. But in story 2, no. Story 3, no. Now, another aspect of what I want you to be looking at and thinking about in terms of the use of language is the use of parataxis and hypotaxis. And I've sort of put an analysis here in terms of this table. Now, just to sort of lay it out for you. On the left-hand side, paratactic. If you're looking at it on the screen, on the left, you have the paratactic. And this would be, and remember, we talked about elaboration, extension, enhancement, projection. And on the right-hand side, we have hypotactic. And just taking a look at the relations and so forth, what you see, the pairs, we notice quite a bit of extension. Now, what's extension? Remember we said that's when you use a conjunction like and, but, or. Paratactic extension, and that is most typical of the way we typically speak. And so let's take a look at this. My second story is about love and loss. A simple sentence. I was lucky. Simple sentence. I found what I love to do. Okay, there's an embedding there. I found what I love to do. Woz and I started Apple in my parents' garage when I was 20. Now, there we have an enhancement, what we would call when, all right? So when I was 20. We worked hard, and in 10 years, Apple had grown from just the two of us in a garage into a 2 billion company with over 4,000 employees. We had just released our finest creation, the Macintosh, a year earlier, and I had just turned 30. And again, well, as Apple grew, we hired someone who I thought was very talented to run the company with me. And again, paratactic extension. But it also, there's other things as Apple grew, so there's a kind of enhancement. It's something that's going on at the same time. We hired someone who, there's some embedding to run the company with me. That's purpose. That's also a kind of enhancement. But then our visions of the future began to diverge, and again, and is used. Eventually we had a falling out. Now that and, its frequency is quite noticeable. When we did, so it's always there's a lot about the enhancement, there's a lot about the circumstances that are being mentioned here. What had been the focus of my entire life was gone, and it was devastating. Again, you notice the parataxis. I felt that I had let the previous generation of entrepreneurs down, that I had dropped the baton, and it was as it was being passed to me. That I had the repetition there. Again, it's sort of it's a kind of paratactic extension. The same kind of structure, same kind of grammatical structure repeated. I felt, again, there's one of those mental processes, I felt. And that is kind of the projected clause, that I had let the previous generation down, that I had dropped the baton. It's what he felt. And again, then a kind of enhancement as it was being passed to me. I met with David Packard and Bob Noyce and tried to apologize for, again, enhancement, purpose. I was a very public figure, and I even thought, again, a kind of projection, thought about running away from the valley. Okay, so I've gone through the analysis, and this is sort of what I come up with then at the end after going through the whole text like this. Now, look at the first table at the top. First story, second story, and third story. And I'm comparing in terms of parataxis and hypotaxis. What do you notice? Compared to what we've been looking at previously, we've been looking at various speeches, right, by these presidents, Obama, by Trump, by Nixon. And remember, we kept noticing a certain proportion. Notice the first story. Parataxis 38%, hypotaxis 62%. It's almost like what we've seen in these speeches. The third story, likewise. But notice in the second story, it's a bit different. It's almost 50-50. It's rather different. The second story, it stands out as being sort of a bit more like the spontaneous, more like what we notice in sort of the spoken style of speaking, almost 50-50. Now, the table below it, what's the difference between these two tables? Well, what I've tried to sort of separate out is the projection. What's projection? That's where it's a that clause. I felt that, I said that, I thought that. And I've separated that out to see how much of the hypotaxis was really projection. In fact, then when I look at the sort of breakdown, parataxis, the hypotaxis, first story, mainly hypotaxis, 27 to 49%. The second story, it's highly paratactic. If I just take out all the projecting, all the that clauses, it is highly paratactic, not so hypotactic. The third story is similar to the first story. The second story stands out. The second story, in terms of its structure, stands out as being more typically a kind of spoken rather than written like. And there is a structure to it. There we can sort of lay out what's the architecture of this speech. Now, let me just go through the first part with you. How do I sort of lay out the structure here? And what my point would be is that, in fact, it's quite sort of obvious. He begins, the first story is about connecting the dots. So he sort of introduces, and that's sort of connecting the dots. That's his title for the story. And that's sort of what everything else is now going to be elaborating on? How is it connecting the dots? And there's a conclusion. There's that last paragraph 9, again, where it shifts to the second person. So there's that block in the middle, 3 through 8. Now, how are these related? Notice in the third paragraph, how does he end? He ends with a question. So why did I drop out? He poses the question. That question then is going to be solved in what follows in paragraphs 4 through 8. Again, he talks about start before I was born and so forth. He mentions this, he introduces this topic. Remember, we've talked about thematic progression in the sense that how you end is very often how you begin the next part. He ends paragraph 4, someday go to college, and begins paragraph 5, and 17 years later, I did go to college. So 5 through 8 is again sort of carrying on the story, elaborating the story about his going to college, what he introduced for the first time in paragraph 4. But there's something curious going on with paragraph 5. Let me just read it to you. 17 years later, I did go to college, but I naively chose a college that was almost as expensive as Stanford. And all of my working class parents' savings were being spent on my college tuition. After 6 months, I couldn't see the value in it. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life and no idea how college was going to help me figure it out. And here I was spending all of my money my parents had saved their entire life. So I decided to drop out and trust that it would all work out okay. It was pretty scary at the time, but looking back, it was one of the best decisions. Interestingly, in each story, he uses that word best. It occurs there, and it just seems to sort of highlight some particular point that he's making, and that comes through in paragraph 5. It stands out. Best decisions, nowhere else in the story. Best decisions I ever made. The minute I dropped out, I could stop taking the required classes that didn't interest me and begin dropping in on the ones that looked interesting. It occurs in this particular paragraph. In this particular paragraph, notice you have the dropped out and the drop in. You have that contrast that was there. It seems that that particular paragraph, he's drawing our attention. And then he goes on then to describe what it was. It wasn't all romantic. So it's something that he's describing in paragraphs 6 through 8. And if we just take a look at 6 through 8, let me give you one example. So 7 and 8 are that example that we see in paragraph 6. So do you notice how he always gives you a kind of sort of lead in to the next part, so that it's well signaled what your structure is, what's the architecture here. Let me give you an example, and then he proceeds to tell you. So he'll ask a question to which the rest of it is the answer, or he'll say, let me give you an example, and then proceed to elaborate on it. There is a structure, and that structure is well laid out to the person listening. In other words, this speech is very well crafted in the sense of its architecture, but at the same time, it comes across with a kind of simplicity that enables one to listen to it as though it were just someone speaking casually with you. There's no sense of, it just seems casual. It just seems something which is like spoken. There's another thing that occurs throughout, and that is the occurrences of you. You'll notice that it sort of occurs at the end of every story. We've mentioned that already. And in paragraph 9, in paragraph 15. And then, but notice that you is very prominent throughout the whole end of the speech. Not just at the very end, but it comes across you, your. We see the occurrences of the second person pronoun, which is gradually increasing as the speech develops. Here's the ending.
When I was young, there was an amazing publication called the Whole Earth Catalog, which was one of the Bibles of my generation. It was created by a fellow named Stuart Brand, not far from here in Menlo Park, and he brought it to life with his poetic touch. This was in the late 60s, before personal computers and desktop publishing, so it was all made with typewriters, scissors, and Polaroid cameras. It was sort of like Google in paperback form 35 years before Google came along. It was idealistic, overflowing with neat tools and great notions. Stuart and his team put out several issues of the Whole Earth Catalog, and then, when it had run its course, they put out a final issue. It was the mid-1970s, and I was your age. On the back cover of their final issue was a photograph of an early morning country road, the kind you might find yourself hitchhiking on if you were so adventurous. Beneath it were the words, "Stay hungry, stay foolish." It was their farewell message as they signed off. Stay hungry, stay foolish. And I have always wished that for myself. And now, as you graduate to begin anew, I wish that for you. Stay hungry, stay foolish. Thank you all very much.
Again, repeating that stay hungry, stay foolish 3 times. But what I want to impress on you is the fact that sometimes simplicity is deliberate. The nature, the attempting to make it sound almost casual and almost like spoken like. The deliberate use, I would say, of this and, this parataxis kind of extension. This all is contributing to a speech that is obviously so well crafted, but at the same time crafted to be casual, crafted to be simple, crafted in such a way as to sound as though he's just speaking to you, telling you his life, encouraging you to live in a particular way. That's what a commencement speech is, but this one, highly effective. So when you think about how effective a speech is, it can look on the surface as though it is something casual and simple, but in fact, it can be something that is very, very deliberate in its design. Very deliberate in its design to sound like it is spoken. That's what I wanted to cover with you today. So I'm finished with what I wanted to cover in the lecture. So I'll let you go here, and if you have any questions that you want to ask, feel free to do so. Okay, so again, I just remind you about your term paper, and hope you're giving it some thought. And if you have questions about what you should choose and whether you're on the right track, feel free to email me as well and ask, and we can also talk about your selection. By no means is that necessary, but if just is something that's concerning you, feel free to ask, and we can talk about it. All right, so remember that. And last but not least, please remember, due this Friday, how is spontaneous spoken language different from the way we typically write, whether for academic or administrative purposes? Some of you have completed it already, good for you. If you haven't, I think I've given you some information today which should be helpful to answer this question. Okay, so it's something that I want you to be thinking about. Okay, thank you, and see you next week.